right, guys, thank you for that last carrier update. Right now, we are excited to get into this roundtable, which deals with one of Anthony's favorite topics, labor.
That's right. I mean, this is one that is, I think, was a big story earlier on in this week, and it continues to develop. And I'm interested in this one just to see what some of the levers that are being pulled here. No railway pun intended here, but what it's going to mean for the entire industry.
So we're here with Matthew Loeffler, who is the armchair attorney, and Lauren Beegan, who is the maritime professor. And we're going to kind of dig into what labor negotiations look like on kind of the front end fringe of getting into ILWU negotiations. We've got the IBEW on strike right now in Canada with the CN's railway workers, if I can speak. So guys, thank you for joining us in this roundtable. And Lauren, I want to start with you on the maritime side. ILWU negotiations, their contract ends on July 1st. And we're kind of sitting at this point where we're like, this is a precipice, right? We've got to get into these contract negotiations. Give us kind of a little story about what's going on there with the ports and where this currently sits.
ILWU is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. It was created in 1937. It's been kind of around since 1902. And the Pacific Maritime Association has been around since 1949. They're the other side of the party here. So they represent the shipping lines and the terminal operators. And obviously the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, those are the labor workers at the port. So, it's a big deal. They've been going through contract negotiations every 3, 5, periodic amount of years. They work in these labor negotiations. They work in these contracts. And currently, the contract that they're working under was actually set to expire in 2019. It was extended 3 years at the time, and nobody saw the pandemic coming, obviously. And so here we are. We're now in the middle of a pandemic. Congestion is through the roof, or it was, when things were starting to really heat up about talking about this new contract negotiation. Actually, this last fall, they had asked for an extension, but 2019 they had already been extended once. So here we are. We're down to the wire here. July 1st is going to be the end of this current contract that they're working under.
And Matthew, also want to get your take on this. Does this set a precedent moving forward? Also, Lauren, please jump in on this one as well, as we can see what kind of some of the outcomes are from this situation.
The story of the American supply chain is the story of organized labor, and the longshoremen remains one of the strongest unions that has ever existed in our industry. 40% of everything coming off the ships go through this group of people. And when we talk about essential work, this is work that has to be done that requires skilled labor. The longshoremen are in a very strong position right now. And in this negotiation, both sides have already said they're going to continue working past July 1st. They're not going to just stop work immediately. This negotiation is being done in good faith, and I expect that they'll find a resolution. But the critical thing here is about wages. That is what we're talking about. Wages and automation on the West Coast, and the Canadian National side, it's again wages and benefits. This is a very strange thing. You have to keep in mind, in 1980, between 50 and 60% of all drivers were unionized. Fast forward to today, of a much smaller portion of that. So organized labor gets the media attention because there's not a lot of them left. And so I'm going to be eagerly watching this discussion and this negotiation. And I know both sides will come to a resolution because we need these goods to continue to flow.
So the interesting thing here is kind of the juxtaposition between what's happening in the U.S. with the ILWU and with IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, in related to Canadian National's Railway in Canada. Can either one of you guys kind of break down what the difference is, if there are any, between implications in the United States labor fight versus the Canadian labor fight?
I think it's a different discussion. Go ahead, Matt.
What I would say is it's actually, I think it's similar. So the Canadian side of things, 750 workers have gone on strike, and their managers have taken over those roles. What they're talking about is wages. Now, what the Canadian Nationals proposed on this side is a 10% increase in wages over the next 3 years. What the union is saying is that doesn't cover inflation. So many workers today are watching their quality of life go backwards. That's not what people expect when their companies they work for make tremendous amounts of money. But the strike is just one of the tools used in these negotiation tactics. We saw the Canadian National drivers go on strike a couple years earlier, and they were on strike for about a week or so. I don't expect to see this happen on the West Coast, at least not right away. But if they can't get to a resolution, that is the tool the union has at its disposal. And I think that if they're unable to get that resolution, they will use the tools that are at their disposal to get the outcome for their members.
And Lauren, want to jump in want you to jump in on this one, please, and Matthew also add on to this. But we're looking at where some of the power dynamics lie in this situation. Where do you see that right now? And I mean, as Matthew mentioned earlier, we are looking at essential workers, folks that are needed for these roles. But where does that power really kind of lie as we look at this situation?
Sure. Well, this actually piggybacks well off of what Matt was just saying as well, and what I had wanted to say about the Canadian National. So this is a different discussion, I would argue, respectfully though, because I think that inflation is definitely a big problem right now. I mean, essentially, if you're not making 8% more than you were a few years ago, then you're losing money. And I think that's really guiding a lot of the conversations about wages. But it's a different discussion with Canadian National, because in that situation, you're able to have the federal government be a little bit more involved. Remember, the ILWU and the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association and the ILWU, this is a private contract negotiation between private entities. It's private business. The U.S. government isn't necessarily automatically involved in this, other than we all want to see a contract come out of this and really be a fruitful thing for everybody to work forward to. And we need our ports to keep working. But in terms of the power dynamics, I think it's a really interesting discussion, at least from the ILWU and the PMA discussion, because we're having profits through the roof, billions of dollars of profits for the ocean carriers, who are, that's basically who the PMA are. And so how do you come into that saying, well, we can give you more money? Automation is also another hugely contentious issue for this negotiation specifically. And something that I think is also kind of start shaking up the power dynamic a little bit.
So we know that the administration that we're currently sat in the U.S. government is very much pro-labor, probably one of the most pro-labor administrations that we've seen in recent history for us. And when we talk about that, do you think that that gives any incentive to the private labor negotiations between PMA and ILWU to get it done internally, because they don't necessarily want that external overreach of a very, very pro-labor government? Matt, I want to start with you. Do you think that that's kind of the case, or do you think that there would be more of a willingness of the government to step in if this doesn't work, not only because of the fact that they are pro-labor, but also because of the fact that they are very, very tuned into what's going on in the ports as well as port disruption?
I think that the government's going to stay away from some of this as best they can. We're talking about ocean carriers that saw $150 billion in profit. And what they're spending in the labor cost is somewhere between maybe $4.5 or $5 billion. And you can't stop the movement of freight. Freight doesn't stop. And so the incentives for both parties is to come to a resolution that gets them to where they want to be, addressing things and problems that the future will have. But I don't see the administration taking a very heavy-handed approach. It might seem like this administration is pro-union or at least pro-worker labor. I think that's fairly a good characterization. But we're still seeing the mass resignation of so many people. And the thing about the longshoremen particularly is you can't outsource what they do. You can't offshore what they do. And because of that necessity, it's very difficult. There's 22,000 members, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a massive, massive union with incredible power. And they know what their bargaining position is. But what they're concerned with, as Lauren kind of alluded to earlier on the automation side, what happens in 5 years? What happens in 10 years? Will those 22,000 jobs become 15,000 jobs? Will it become a different type of environment? And these are the concerns the union has to take into account as they make their positions known. Whereas in the Canadian National side, they can replace them with managers temporarily. And really, they're fighting about things like benefits and time off and wages. But for the longshoremen, this is a much more existential threat of what the business will look like in the future.
I think that's a great aspect there, looking forward. And so, Lauren, can you jump in here on what some of the near-term implications are versus some of the long-term implications as we look at this entire situation?
Sure. I mean, near term, I think the concern that everybody has is, business doesn't like instability. Business doesn't like questions. And so even though they're saying that nobody's planning on striking, is that going to hold true? I think we're seeing that in the East Coast getting a little bit more congestion. So what we are talking about here is the ILWU is the West Coast labor. ILA, the International Longshore Association, that is the East Coast labor. And so they're not in a contract negotiation right now. And so we've seen a little bit of diversifying of ports of entry. That might have just been trying to control the movement movement of the goods a little bit more. But that also might have been, at least in part, in advance of trying to figure out how to get around. Nobody wants to sit in a ship for however many months anymore. They want to make sure they're still able to get their goods in, whether they're going to pay a little bit more or rates are expensive anyway. So you might as well gain that little bit of control. So that's what I think we're going to see in the near term. In the long term, I don't know. I think we're obviously going to come out of this with a negotiation of some sort. Hopefully this sets the stage for a longer term contract. There's a lot of things that are unique to this moment. And so maybe this will be a shorter contract. Maybe we'll see a negotiation happen in a shorter term once things level out and even out again. But I think that, the uncertainty is what business doesn't like. And so I think business is trying to take a little bit more control over, and by business, I mean the beneficial cargo owners, the shippers moving their goods inside. Remember, 90% of everything moves by ocean transit. And so you're looking at 90% of everything that this country uses going through some sort of a port of entry, because it's going to at some point be on an ocean carrier. And so this is critically important. I think the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, is the previous mayor of Boston. He was, he's a big labor guy, and he also understands what a maritime city looks like. And so, I think that he is probably keeping a watchful eye over this. But like Matt was saying, he this is a very pro-labor administration right now. And I think that the businesses themselves, the private entities here, would like to work it out themselves.
Matt, really quickly before we let you guys go today, also thank you both for this. This is an awesome discussion. When we're talking about the immediate implications on if there are labor issues at the ports with the ILWU contract, what does that look like bleeding over into the trucking side of things, into the dray side of things, into the goods movement by truck?
Things are going to cost more. And that's the fact of the matter. That's what inflation is all about. When you talk about transportation, the biggest cost you have is fuel. The second biggest cost is labor. And if you want to have access to the goods and services you're trying to move, you're going to have a lot of challenges. The thing I would also mention here is that this profit levels are not normal in this industry. To see that kind of profit for the ocean carriers, $150 billion, that's not normal. These companies are used to having very small margins. And so as they negotiate with these unions, they say, look, this is not always going to be super profitable. We know this. On our truckload side, we know the same thing. Operating ratios are generally not much above 90. I mean, the reality we are going to face is that we have to come to grips with the jobs that are out there are not able to compensate people and keep at the same level they've been accustomed to. And that is going to require people to move around from place to place and for organized labor to negotiate for better positions for their members. What it looks like on the transportation and the surface side is likely going to be more expensive goods and less availability of things that you want to buy. Everything comes on a truck.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. Great to have both of y'all, as always. And I think this is a good little combo. We're going to have to get them back together once again for another roundtable.
I love Lauren Beagan. She is phenomenal. Thank you for having us on. I appreciate it.
Right back at you, Matt. And thank you very much for the discussion. This was really great. And, it's an important issue, and I'm glad people are keyed into it.
Absolutely, guys. Have a great weekend. We will talk to you again soon. We're going to take one last very short break. We'll be back to wrap up your show in just a few minutes.